Hello, this is Adam, and this is my argument for the universe's necessity. So I'm going to apologise straight up that there's going to be a lot of reading because there's a lot of information to get through, and it's just easier to have it outlined on a script. So forgive me if there's the eye contact shifts a bit. I look a bit bow-eyed or cross-eyed, but that's how it's going to be for this entry, let's say, today. So let's get to it straight away, shall we? My argument for the universe's necessary existence is thus. So, premise 0. Any explanation must be consistent with our senses, observations and logic if it's going to be valid. I think everyone will accept that. Premise 1. Anything that exists does so necessarily. By the way, I will make an effort to put these premises up on the screen so it's easier just to digest and you can see the flow of the argument. So anything that exists, just to repeat, does so either necessarily by the fact of its existence or as a derivative from some necessary existence. So you're looking at the very old arguments there with God's existence, but we're just applying it to the universe here. So premise 2 is the universe exists. Quite uncontroversial. Most of us could agree. You and I exist. You're watching me. I'm talking to you at the moment. The universe exists, right? Premise 3, maybe a bit more controversial. The universe has always existed. And then the conclusion to my argument is, therefore, the universe necessarily exists. Obviously, this is just the syllogistic form of the argument. I'm going to elaborate on what I mean, why my premises are valid, and why the conclusion follows on. So let's get into it, shall we? So let's get into the premises explained. So premise 0, or the underlying foundational premise, is easily defended given that if we want any epistemological basis for our beliefs about the world, then they must conform with what we observe and sense. For example, science tells us that the stars and galaxies are accelerating away from each other and us, so that's Hubble's law, which logically indicates a point of origin for the expansion. Consistency is that which is static across similar circumstances. For example, we can't insist on a cause for all things but give a special grace to God, as God is something or part of that which we are attempting to explain, i.e. the universe. By definition, God is something, be that a real entity or an idea in the minds of human beings. So consistency is a universal given across humanity and in all fields. Everything from sports to law, from mathematics to grammar, have inbuilt consistency, as without it these fields don't really have any meaning, do they? And meaning is a requisite for understanding. So, premise 1. Premise 1, the explanation is quite straightforward. Given X exists, it has one of two consistent reasons for its existence. The first could be something caused its existence. More accurately, a new state of matter developed from the finite sum of all matter and energy. Secondly, it exists necessarily, i.e. it has always existed and cannot not exist. Any other explanation is simply inconsistent. So God as an answer, a lot of you may think God created the universe, but God as an answer is inconsistent, as God is something and contained within the universe itself. Even if it's assumed God materially created the universe, God is inconsistent with what we know and illogical, which invalidates it. It's an invalid explanation according to premise 0, the aforementioned premise 0. So on God's inconsistency then, let's go a bit further into this. It is inconsistent in two ways. So God is inconsistent, which is why we must reject it as an answer to what caused the universe. Cat doing a bit of mountain climbing there. Firstly, as there's no evidence God created the universe, or more accurately, God is not required in our explanation according to our observations, i.e. Hubble's law, conservation and entropy, etc. There's incidentally no evidence that the universe was created at all, by the way. as the Big Bang Theory describes a period of inflation from an incredibly dense and hot state. In short, God is not consistent with our observations. It just isn't. It's not consistent with our observations and senses. So see premise 0. Secondly, God is illogical as an explanation. Certain characteristics are integral to the common idea of the Abrahamic monotheistic God. Goes back quite a long way. So you know, the whole omni characteristics such as omnipotence, transcendence, omniscience, and all of that jazz. An example is the very famous rock paradox, in which an omnipotent God can create a rock heavy enough that it cannot lift it. If God cannot create the rock, then God isn't omnipotent. If it can create the rock and it cannot lift it, then it's not omnipotent. Either way, it restricts its own power, which is contradictory, and it just implodes, doesn't it? Another example is God's transcendence. If God is materially apart from the universe and without form, dimension, and outside of time, then it logically can't affect or create anything. As the ex nihilo explanation is inconsistent, and we observe that cause and effect are characteristic of the universe, and everything in the universe is, by definition, something, or has form, dimension, and is measurable in time, etc. So let's move on then. If God is not the cause of the universe, what about the from nothing explanation, which is, to my mind anyway, equally as crazy? On the ex nihilo, to use the Latin term explanation, that's also inconsistent. So the common argument, the universe came from nothing, is inconsistent. We know this because of our observation. Firstly, our common everyday experience tells us that things, more accurately states of matter, have causes. We live in a universe of cause and effect. It's a rare sight for a 7-ton pink African elephant to just randomly fall out of the sky, just materialise, just teleport into place, just crush people underneath. Things don't come from nothing, and I don't think I've met anyone. Write in the comments if you have. You might be smoking something. But I have never met anyone that's seen something come from nothing. More scientific observations suggest that the universe didn't come from nothing as a whole, but expanded from an already existent state to its current form, which is commonly known as the Big Bang Theory. It's actually a theory of inflation. The second reason why the ex nihilo explanation for the universe's existence doesn't work is that it's illogical. Causeless things are illogical by the definition of a thing. If a thing is reducible to a state of matter or energy and has all the traits of a thing, such as dimension, entropy and such, then it logically has a cause. It's inconsistent to, on the one hand, accept our sensible observations that all that exists within the universe has a cause on the one hand, but that some things don't. It doesn't square, does it? So let's move on then to premise 2. Explanation of my own premise 2. So premise 2 is quite straightforward, quite uncontroversial. The universe exists. You could argue, you could have this very radical skepticism, which was so famously adopted by René Descartes, the 17th century French philosopher. He was very radical, as he said, oh, well, can I be sure that anything exists? And of course, you have the kind of matrix thing going on where you doubt anything exists, but then you get to the point where you know that you yourself exist, because if you doubt everything else, you can be certain that you are doubting. So we can go down that rabbit hole if you like, but most people will agree, in terms of consistently looking at the world and using their senses, that the universe exists. That's quite uncontroversial. So this premise seems to be valid too, doesn't it? As we experience our surroundings and are self-aware, sensible and thinking individuals, we can all implicitly agree that the universe exists. We can at least concede that I exist, or you exist. Otherwise, who's speaking now? Who's listening? The assertion that I do not exist is illogical and self-detonating. if I do not exist, then who or what is making the statement I do not exist? Again, it's like the God thing with omnipotence and transcendence. It kind of implodes in on itself. Similarly, observations and sensible information about our universe exists and is interpreted by our brains with certain classifications of things, like a computer keyboard consensually agreed upon to be a computer keyboard. Existence itself is a consistent and therefore valid premise. So moving on to premise 3 then. This is a bit trickier, but in my opinion valid nonetheless. The universe has always existed. The evidence seems to point to this anyway. So this is to state that there was never a time when it did not exist, as time itself, or entropy, is a trait of and law of and within the universe itself, if that makes sense. As long as time has existed, the universe itself has existed, because it's a trait of the thing itself. But this is not some weird, awkward wordplay thing. It's consistent with our observations, so it conforms with premise Z, specifically the leading theory of the current state of our universe. So the Big Bang theory is actually a description of a process of inflation from an infinitesimal point of hotness and density. It's a tiny, tiny little point of they call it the singularity. It doesn't actually describe the universe exploding out of nothing in some random sort of farting a void somewhere that produces all the matter and energy in the universe. It doesn't come out of nothing or emerge from God's pinky finger or something like that. It actually describes an existent state transitioning into another existent state, which is our current universe. The law of conservation also indicates an existent universe. So not a universe with a beginning, as all energy and matter are neither created nor destroyed in a closed system. So the law of entropy itself does not actually state that energy and matter fade from existence in some weird wraith-like way. They merely tend towards disordered states, conforming to the prevailing heat-death theory of the fate of the universe, which most people are familiar with. So in all instances, a beginningless universe is indicated. The alternatives that we've looked at, so God and coming from nothing, have been shown to be illogical and nonsensical, and are thus inconsistent and invalid. And then it's at this point that I apply Occam's razor to the matter. Premise 3 is the explanation with the fewest assumptions, and therefore is the most likely to be true. So it's an inductive argument in that sense. We're dealing in probabilities here. So it's no good falling back on, say, the principle of sufficient reason either, as the reasoning behind premise 3 is consistent. The evidence suggests, or more accurately, the best explanation is that the universe is actually cyclical, with states of matter and energy constantly transitioning into and out of existence. Which isn't certain, it's just the best explanation that we can derive from the different alternatives that we have. But with the elementary sum of all matter and energy always existent for an infinite cycle. So the universe has always existed and necessarily exists. You don't need a God, and you don't need an out-of-nothing explanation which isn't satisfactory in either case, because you still have special pleading. Especially with you have special pleading with the God example. You can't turn around and say, oh, well, we have an infinite regress without God. And then say, well, God doesn't need an explanation though, because that's it's just as unsatisfactory, isn't it? So the universe does have a beginning, but then you have this roadblock of God who's just there, chilling out for eternity, before he decides to create the universe. Excuse me. So on the conclusion, the premises follow on from each other, with 2 and 3 the basis for the validity of C, the conclusion. The universe necessarily exists, given we cannot rely on a greater necessary cause, or if we reject option 1 in premise 1 of its existence, as the nothing and God options are inconsistent. So that was my argument for the necessary universe. I actually think the universe itself is necessary as a whole system, not necessarily the states of matter within them. So this is quite important for me to talk about, but I'll have to elaborate in a completely separate entry or video, because again it's going to get quite deep, and I don't want the video to be any longer than it needs to be. want it to be succinct. I want it to get out there and see what you think, see if you can tear it apart a bit, provide different explanations. Did God create the universe? If so, is there a good reason why, a good consistent reason why? But it is what it is at the moment, guys. This is my argument for the universe's necessity as a system itself. It's a looped, necessary system with contingent states within it. Contingent being states that could have been otherwise. So that's you have different states of matter that come into and out of existence, but the system itself is eternal and necessary. But I'll leave the argument in the syllogistic form up on the screen just for a few minutes more, hopefully at the moment while I'm babbling on and editing, and you can have a good look at it, pause it if you need to, tell me what you think. Am I missing something, or is this a good argument for the explanation of why we're all here, why the universe exists? Let me know what you think, and I shall see you next time. This is Adam signing off.